And so it's great to see. This is the first time I've seen you all live. So this is really fun for me. And we even have Roshan up here, whose name shows up now as Samuel, but it's really, he goes by his middle name, Roshan. And he lives in India. I know we have some other kids here who are from Indian background, right? Ashwin and Saraga, is your family's both Indian background? But Roshan actually lives in India. It is 5:30 in the morning where he is. So I told him if he yawns, we will all understand why. So great to see you all. And yes, if you're eating your supper like Sarah looks like she might be, that is just fine. Eat away. And great to see you. And I don't know if we have anyone on here who's not showing their video, but I'm glad you all are brave enough to show your video. Great. Okay, so this is our first time we're meeting together live, and we're going to be discussing the Unit 1 MCQs and from AP Classroom. Can you just give me a thumbs up if you were able to do them, either on the, the printing out the sheet that I gave you or on AP Classroom? Oh, fabulous. Great. Okay. So without further ado, we're going to go over to those. Just a couple of other things. The AP exam, how many of you have taken AP exams in the past, a previous year? Some of you have, then some of you, it's your first one. This year, a change is that all of you will be doing the digital exam. And it won't feel exactly like AP Classroom, but they're trying to make AP Classroom feel a little more like the digital platform on that you'll be using in the exam itself. So I think that's nice. Okay, so I'm glad you all found your way around AP Classroom. And I am now going to share my screen. Oh, some of you have taken the SAT digitally? That's being done digitally now, huh? Oh, here's Ella. Ella Kate. We have two Ellas. I've never had an Ella in my class before, and now I have two, of course. So yeah, okay. Good. I'm sure you all will be keeping up a little chat going on this. I will probably not be looking at it because, I'm 72 years old and I can't look at two things at the same time. But you all can do that and that's fine. Oh, hi, Tabitha. Good to see you. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and we're going to see these. Okay, this is the one I want. Okay. Give me a thumbs up if you can now see my screen. Can you see my screen? Can you see the whole thing or is it kind of half a screen? Is it good? Is it okay?
Yeah, we can see the whole thing.
You can see the whole thing? Okay, good. I want to keep you guys up on I have two screens. I want to keep you guys up on my top screen since there's so many of us and I can see all of you. And then I'm going to probably read off my paper here for questions. Okay, so let's look at the first one. Now, the first thing that you should do when you come to these APUSH MCQs on the exam and now is look down at, do you see this thing in red down here? Can you all see that? What's that? Tabitha, yeah, Tabitha, right? Do I get your name wrong? It says TJ Arteni. Do you go by TJ or is that like your parents' initials?
No, I don't. It's just when we were making the Zoom account with my dad. I wasn't trying to answer any questions.
Okay.
I just had my hand up for a second. So
okay. Okay, Sebastian says it's the attribution. And feel free, by the way, in these discussions, I know you're all muted. If you know it's not noisy in your house, I'm absolutely 100% fine with you being unmuted. You know, if you've got little brothers and sisters or cats and dogs that are fighting and biting in the background, feel free to mute. But it's fine with me and makes it for an easier conversation if you aren't muted, because then you can just jump right in and answer something, okay? So, yeah, and again, I don't always look at the chat thing. But yeah, it's the attribution, says Sebastian. Sebastian, tell us what that means. What's the attribution? Oh dear, where did Sebastian go? There he is.
Oh, yeah. It tells you where the text is from, and apparently it was written by this historian in 2012, Karen.
Right. This tells us it's written by a historian. So is this a primary document or a secondary document? Ah, Joshua did. That's a good way. Hold up 2 fingers. Secondary document. Right. We know that by the date. If it was a primary document, it'd be back from, 1493. Okay. So this is a historian. He's writing, or she is writing about this early time period. So could we have somebody, how about Saraga? Could you just read us this passage here that we're going to be, all the questions are going to somehow relate to? Okay, would you mind doing that?
Yes.
With express.
Sorry, what?
Could you just read the passage aloud to us? So we all, I know we've done it, but let's refresh ourselves.
Okay. On the western side of the ocean, movements of people and ideas preceded the Atlantic connection. Great empires in the Valley of Mexico on the Mississippi River had collapsed or declined in the centuries before 1492. As Columbus embarked on his first transatlantic voyage, the Mexica, or Aztecs, were consolidating their position in Mexico. Their city was a center of both trade and military might. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, held 200,000 people, a population greater than in the largest city of contemporary Europe. The Mississippian culture spread east and west from its center, the city of Cahokia, on the Mississippi River near the site of modern St. Louis. It was a successor to earlier cultures, evidence of which can be seen in the great ceremonial mounds they built. Cahokia declined and was ultimately abandoned completely in the later 13th century. Throughout the Southeast, smaller mound building centers continued.
Excellent. Boy, you read really, really nicely, Saraga. You may get called on again. That was great. Okay, so this is a little snippet from this book about the Atlantic and world history. And so let's move right on to question number 1. Let me scroll down. And who wants to read question 1? How about Ephraim? Would you do that?
All right. Number 1, which of the following contributed most significantly to the population trend in pre-Columbian Mexico described in the excerpt?
Okay, give us the choices
Do you
here.
want me to read the answers?
Yeah.
Oh, A, migration in pursuit of fertile lands. B, trade and settlement resulting from maize cultivation. C, low birth rates and high death tolls as a result of European diseases. And D, internal conflict between groups causing political instability.
Okay. Now, how would you begin sorting those out? What would be the first thing? Zoe, what did you notice?
Okay, the first thing I noticed is we can do process of elimination. So we can immediately eliminate A because while it does say that there might have been like migration in pursuit of fertile land, that's not the main idea of the text. And so we can cross that one out. And it also, D is beyond the text because it doesn't really say anything about eternal conflict. So while there might have been eternal conflict caused by these, this thing of events, it's not exactly what the text is saying. And then C has nothing to do with the text because there's nothing about low birth rates and high death tolls. And so we can get rid of that one. And so that leaves B. And so if we check B, we can say the trade and settlement resulting from maize cultivation, and that obviously does describe what the text is trying to say.
Right, right. And it's a little hard because did they mention maize? And what's maize again? You all know what maize is?
Corn.
Corn. And they're going to use the term maize just because that was the Indian term and you should know it, but some kids might not, and they might be confused. You know, if they said corn, we'd all get it. Maize cultivation. And they don't mention maize though in the passage, do they? But so they're going with not just reading comprehension, you know, reading this and being able to find the answer in sentence 3 or something, but they're looking at, can you bring what you know? And cultivation of corn, of maize is going to be a key idea. So that would be it. Okay. Anyone else have something else to add to that one? Another thought? Or how can you knock out C, low birth rates and high death tolls as a result of European diseases? Why does that one not work for this question? Joshua. How about Joshua? I saw him, and we can get someone else too. But Joshua.
I saw that the main theme of the passage and the context was about growing civilizations through like trade and kind of expansion. So it didn't make sense that low birth rates would describe a population growth.
That's a good thing, right? And also, the passage is really is it describing before Columbus or after Columbus? That's kind of the big turning point. Which is it talking about?
Before Columbus.
Before Columbus. Oh, Sebastian has his hand raised. I see it. Sebastian, do you have a thought?
No, that was what I said.
Well, good. Great. Yeah, that's a way to think about it too, right? That this is talking about the early days, even, you know, a couple of 100 years before any Europeans come on over. So that can't be it. That could be knocked out. And as Heimler says in his history videos about him doing MCQs, he said, usually they're going to be two answers that you can just knock out pretty quickly if you know anything at all. And then there are going to be two that are a little bit close, you know, that are a little bit harder to decide which it is. But if you've only got 2 to decide between, it's easier than 4. Okay, very good. And let's go on to 2. Let's see. Ella Kate, can you read us 2 here?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Which of the following best characterizes the Mississippian societies described in the excerpt? Should I read the answers too?
Yeah, read the answers too.
They mixed agriculture and hunter-gatherer economies that favored the development of permanent villages. B, they were nomadic people who utilized river systems to move throughout the region. C, they lived in isolated, impermanent communities and left very little trace of their presence once a settlement had been abandoned. D, they used advanced agricultural practices like irrigation to support economic growth.
Good. How about somebody tell us, like, which 1 or 2 could you immediately zap out as being obviously wrong? Anyone find 1 or 2 that you could do that with? Helen, you've got an idea. Helen, let's hear yours.
Okay, I would immediately eliminate B and C. I would
Mhm.
eliminate B because it was talking about they were nomadic peoples who used the river systems to move throughout the region. And while they did expand, Cahokia was a city, which means that's a permanent settlement, so
Right.
not nomadic. And then
Mhm.
C says they lived in isolated, impermanent communities and left very little trace of their presence once the settlement had been abandoned. But the excerpt talks about how they have great ceremonial mounds, which means that they have evidence they were there,
Right.
and they were very permanent because it was a city.
Right. Very, very good. And I know somebody in the class mentioned somewhere, I don't know if it was in their application essay or somewhere, that they'd actually been to Cahokia. Is that anyone who was here? I think they were pretty young when they were there. Anyone here been to Cahokia, or is it someone who's not here? Well, I was impressed. I would love to go to Cahokia sometime, but yeah, if you look at, photos of it now, yeah, it still has these big earth mound places that they really, don't know quite how they built them up. But they did them, obviously put a lot of organization and time into doing so. Wasn't something you do in a week. These are major things. So yeah, not impermanent, right? It's very easy, by the way, especially in the heat of the exam, to misread impermanent as permanent and to get it to just flip it wrong. And they'll often have an answer that will be the exact opposite of what you want. Okay, so those are two that could be zapped out, B and C. So now we're left with A and D. Which one do you think is the best characterization of the Mississippian societies? How about Joshua?
I would say answer choice A for two
Mhm.
reasons. The first reason, answer choice D is kind of off topic. Even though they talk about the city being near a river, they don't talk about any agricultural practices or economic status.
Yeah.
And the second reason is based on the context of the whole passage. I can tell that they had like permanent cities and villages because of the city of Cahokia and the small trading centers that they left behind, but also that they weren't strictly agricultural because they did move around a little bit.
Great. Excellent. Everyone else agree that A is the correct answer there? And sometimes I'll tell you that the right answer seems kind of boring. Like, well, that's kind of obvious, but often that's the right answer. Okay, here we go. Let's go on to number 3. Okay, let's see. How about Zoe is offering to read this one?
Okay, which of the following most directly contributed to the advanced development of the both pre-Columbian American societies described in this excerpt? A. Creation of military forces stronger than those of most rival societies. B. Access to waterways to transport goods and trades with other societies. C. Adaptation to use of the natural environment for their own benefit. D. Transfer of power through inheritance, which reinforce spiritual claims to authority.
Oh, are there any you can zap out here? I think this one's a little bit harder. Anyone have some you could just zap out? Roshan.
Okay, so I'm pretty sure we can just zap out A and D
Mm-hmm.
because while the text mentions that they were kind of gathering people together into Cahokia, that's not a main feature of the text. It's not really what it's talking about. And they don't talk about inheritance at all. So those two just seem off.
Right. They're kind of off topic, right. And very good. So now we're left with B and C. Anyone, and both of those can seem like, yeah, they're kind of, I could make an argument for either one. But which one do you think might be probably the better one? Let's see. Sebastian typed in B. Can you tell us why, Sebastian?
Yeah, I don't recall any, I do know about the waterways. For one thing, the Mississippians had access to the enormous Mississippi network of rivers that would immensely benefit American trade hundreds of years later. And, and while the Aztecs built all those canals, the Mississippians built the mounds. I can't really think that I guess that's a use, but it's not particularly beneficial. Just looks really cool. It's
Well, they might have thought it was beneficial to them. Okay, what do you think, Joshua?
possibly.
Yeah. Let's get some other points of view here. What do you think, Joshua?
I think it's answer choice C
Mm-hmm.
because in the question it's talking about uh pre pre-Columbian American societies. I think it's asking for maybe a more general scope than just like the Cahokian civilization. And I think that like C is a bit more general with kind of the description of the answer. So I think it's also a more safe choice because it's talking about adaptation and use of the natural environment. So that could be a lot of stuff. That could be agriculture. That could be the waterways. That could be
Could be the
the
earth that they
mountains.
moved up, right? That they built into mounds, and yeah, they maybe used some sort of natural thing as shovels or something to build them up. Who knows? But yeah, that's considered the correct answer. I think this is kind of a tricky one, because you could make an argument, like Sebastian did, that they probably did use the waterways. You know, I'm sure they had some sort of canoes and flatboats or something, rafts. But yeah, here the answer they consider the right answer is C, adaptation to and use of the natural environment for their own benefit. So I guess you could have to make an argument that well, those mounds were very beneficial to them because it would help their, I don't know, what do you think how could you make an argument that the mounds were beneficial to the people there? What might you say? If you were a historian, you were trying to make that argument, what might you say?
The cultural significance of those kind of things is very important to civilizations. Also, a lot of kind of natural occurring or naturally built like mounds or rocks could actually serve as calendars or some way to mark time, like the
Yeah,
Aztecs.
yeah, like Stonehenge does that, right? Yeah, they would have knowledge of what's going to happen at that certain point of the year is going to, you know, cast a shadow this way or that way, right? Yeah.
I would guess that all those crazy things they built would also be like a pretty significant display of power, like
Oh,
that some other group of people wouldn't want to mess with them because like they
don't
have
mess
the
with
free
us.
time to like
Yeah.
build these crazy things.
Yeah, we build mounds here. Don't fight with us, right? Yeah, that's a good point. It would be a display of power. I'm sure it was. That's a very good point. So that would be for their benefit, right? And it
I
could
have
have,
another thing.
yeah.
Sorry. I
Sure.
don't know if Cahokia did this thing, but in my grandparents' neighborhood in Ohio, there's an Indian burial mound, which is a mound, and it had they would bury their dead in there. So maybe I don't know if Cahokia did this, but it could be used as a burial place.
Yeah, I think they've definitely found a lot of remains inside these mounds when they do dig into them, right? And that could be for their benefit. Yeah, we had to bury our people somewhere, so we build this huge mound. Yeah, so there could be ways to look at it like that, but I could see Sebastian's point that, well, what would be the benefit of this, you know? So some of these questions you might find or would almost be like better discussion questions than this is the right answer, this is the wrong answer. I mean, that's just going to be the way it is. And it's interesting to try to argue a couple of ways on some of them. Okay, so we've got our next passage. So do we start reading right at the beginning or do we do what?
We go to the source.
We go to the source. So let's see what it is. It's in red here. I made these in red. What type of source are we looking at here? Is it secondary or?
The primary source.
Hold up your finger, right? Primary source, one. Primary source, how can you tell?
The date.
The date, yeah, the date. If it's old, it's a primary source. Okay, and who's it by? What's his role? Richard Hakluyt?
An English government official.
English government official, okay? So he's sort of speaking for the government, or he might have an opinion on what the government should do. And so this is 1584. Have the British set up an effective colony yet in America?
Not yet.
Not yet. Sebastian thinks this is an unusual name for a 16th century Brit. I think that's true. I think it's, do you think, what nationality would it be? Sort of Dutch or something? I don't know. Maybe someone could Google that on the side and see where he's originally from. So let's see, let's have somebody, how about Tabitha? Can you read us this passage? You don't have to do it in a British accent, but if you know how to do that, you're welcome to. But just with energy and enthusiasm.
All right. The second chief and principal end of colonization consists in the sale of the mass of our cloves and other commodities of England, and in receiving back of the needful commodities that we now receive from all other places of the world. This one thing is to be done, without which it were in vain to go about this, and that is the matter of planting colonies and fortification. We are to plant upon the mouths of the great navigable rivers which are there in America, by strong order of fortification, and there to plant our colonies. And these fortifications shall keep the native people of America in obedience and good order. Without this planting in due time, we shall never be able to have full knowledge of the language, manners, and customs of the people in those regions. And although by other means we might attain to the knowledge thereof, yet being not there fortified and strongly seated, the French that swarm with a multitude of people, or other nations, might secretly fortify and settle themselves before us.
Okay, thank you. That was excellent. Very, very good. And notice the word planting. If you just read the title of the book, this is a little book, A Discourse on Western Planting, what might you think he was talking about?
Possibly planting a colony.
Well, that is a very good guess, because that is what he's talking about. He's talking about planting colonies. But if you didn't know that, like if you didn't read this whole thing, what might you think it was, Joshua?
I would think it's cash crops like tobacco or sugar.
Yeah, you might think it's an agricultural, article, how to plant sugar in the Caribbean or something. You wouldn't really know. It sounds, we use the term planting usually to mean planting crops, but here he's talking about planting colonies. And it seems that the people of his day would have known that that's what that word obviously meant, because here, do you see this one where they put it in brackets, colonies, and that is the matter of planting and fortification. Like they didn't have colonies, wasn't in his original little book. So he's talking about why they should colonize, okay? And by the way, I want to show you one thing. If I do this, can you now see you see a different screen? Okay, different page? Okay.
Yes.
This is some excerpts from this, okay? Discourse of Western Planting, or on Western Planting. And look at his first point. If someone could just read this opening, just the boldface, you probably can't even read the little stuff. How about
I can.
Kyle?
Chat, this Western discovery will be greatly for the enlargement of the gospel of Christ, whereunto the princes of the Reformed religion are chiefly bound, among whom her majesty is principal.
Great. And that first word there is that. It's just written in very fancy fonts. Okay, that's this Western discovery. Okay, what's he talking about there? What's the first principle of why colonies should be planted?
Religious purposes.
Yeah, religious purposes. They're going to spread the gospel. Now, what surprises you about that? This is a British guy? Or what might surprise you about that? Maybe it doesn't.
I think the Spanish were more concerned about religious purposes.
Yeah, we usually think of the Spanish, the Catholics. They were wanting to force all the Indians to be Catholics, and we read a lot of things about that. And do you notice one word in there? Whereunto the princes of the Reformed religion. What does that mean? Reformed religion?
Is this Protestant?
Yeah, that's going to be Protestant, okay, not Catholic, okay, Reformation. And so it's kind of like the Spanish have been getting in there with their Catholicism. We better get in there with our Reformed Protestant, our British version of it. We better get in there first or next, you know, and we're going to take this land because no, the Spanish aren't there yet. But he also, okay, so that's, and it's interesting because we kind of get these dichotomies, like you're either this or you're that. But the British were very interested in this whole idea of converting the Indians, bringing the true religion to the pagans. You know, they were very interested in that also. It just wasn't, you know, quite as big a push as the Spanish, but it was not like they were not interested in it at all or never thought of the idea. They were. Okay, so let's go back to our question here. Okay, we're back here now. Okay. So let's see. Question 4. Okay, I'll read this one. Question 4. Which of the following developments in the 1500s, so that's the time period of this writing, which of the following developments in the 1500s is best illustrated by the excerpt? Okay, and maybe you can give me a thumbs up or down as we go through these, okay? A, European settlers faced resistance from Native Americans. Now, again, we don't want to know, is that true? We want to know, is that the answer to this question? B, so I think most of you thought that was not the right one. B, Europeans transported enslaved Africans to the Americas to produce sugar. I think people are starting to go, it may be peer pressure here. Once you see a couple of people put a thumbs down, you might go for that. But yeah, it doesn't seem to, doesn't mention sugar, and it doesn't mention African slaves, does it, in that passage?
No, it does not.
No, it really doesn't.
Africa.
C, Europeans sought new sources of wealth in the Americas. Oh, a lot of people say, yeah. Yeah, I think I'd agree with you. Sonnet is kind of like, I don't know. That's okay. And in fact, you shouldn't make a firm decision until you've read all the choices, because it might be D. Okay, let's look at D. European missionaries traveled to the Americas seeking religious converts. Now that we saw from the first part of Hakluyt's discourse, but it's not from this excerpt, okay? He was interested in that, but it wasn't what he's talking about here. So that's important. So we think, and again, C is kind of like, oh, but that's such a boring, simple answer, but it's the right answer, you know, that's what it is. He's talking about getting new wealth out of the place. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Hakluyt's call for the English to learn about Native American language, manners, and customs best represents which of the following developments in the 1500s? A, Native Americans and Europeans partnered for trade. B, Europeans introduced maize cultivation to the Americas. What do you think of that one? Oh, Roshan says, boo. No. Native Americans were sent in large numbers into slavery in Europe. D, Europeans refused defensive military alliances with Native Americans. Yeah. So, yeah, so we're left with, which one, A?
A.
Yeah, we're left with A. And that is the correct answer. And that was a thing. I mean, I think too, it's important to remember that, you know, the Europeans definitely wanted to trade for stuff in America. And that's brought out in the passage about, you know, we want to sell our stuff, our extra stuff to them, and we want to get raw materials from them. But the Indians also, once they met these explorers, these people coming over from Europe, do you think they were interested in European goods? Did they want to trade? Very much. What sort of things would the Indians want from the Europeans coming over? What sort of things would they be interested in?
Guns.
Guns, yep, guns. That's an important one. They were very, very impressed with this sort of weapon. They had weapons. They had, you know, bows and arrows and things. But they wanted, yeah, they wanted. We want those fire sticks. We want those things too. And Joshua, do you have some other thoughts on things that Europeans would want? Oh, Joshua wrote in the chat, horses. Yeah. I mean, think of all the cowboy movies you've seen with Indians riding around on bareback on horses, racing across the prairie. They had no horses here. That was all from the Europeans. Oh, yes. Well, Sarago says she too would like horses. But Roshan, you do horseback riding, right? Over in India. He's got a picture of him with his horse. Oh, Roshan also said probably any steel items too. I don't think they had steel yet. Yeah, I don't know if they had any. I mean, they probably had, you know, copper, silver, gold. But yeah, they wouldn't have had steel. And yeah, they would have wanted that. You know, if you've been using a stone-headed tomahawk and you had the option now of something made of iron or steel, you would want that. And very soon, it didn't take long, the Indian peoples became dependent upon these trade goods. They wanted them. We'll see when we get to our cartoon conversation coming up in a few weeks, we'll see some early images from this, you know, the Unit 2 time period, showing the Indians wearing a combination of clothing. It's obviously not, you know, they're not just wearing something made out of deer hides anymore. No, they're wearing a sort of a combination of clothing. They're taking cloth from the colonists and the settlers, and they like this stuff. And also, oh, something you drink. I hope nothing that you drink, but something that adult people might drink.
Beer?
Any sort of alcohol. They may have had some types of alcohol in the Americas, but not a lot. And it wasn't a big thing. And the European traders very soon realized like this was a hot item for the Indian population. And it was a shame because they used that to really exploit the people, to either get them drunk and then have them agree to some terrible treaty, or to just use it as a way to, you know, kind of manage them. I've often heard, or not often heard, I remember hearing that because the Indian population, the North American Indian population, had very little experience with alcoholic drinks, that they just didn't know how to handle it. They didn't have what's called a set and setting. Like it's very common, at least for, you know, my family is Jewish. It's common among Jews to say, well, we don't have much alcoholism among Jews because it has its place. It's at Friday night with the whole family there. You all get a little, you know, a little cup of wine and you drink it ceremonially, and it has its set and setting. This is when we do wine. But a lot of stuff in the Bible is about, you know, not getting drunk. Joshua, you have a thought?
Oh, I just want to say that most alcohol outside of the US now and then probably then was a lot less alcohol concentrated. So
Mhm.
there was probably a lot more actual alcohol in the beer that they gave to the Native Americans.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point. Right, there's all levels of alcoholic content. And that the Indians never having experience, they didn't have any customs on how you used alcohol. Like you use it in this ceremony, but not in everyday life or whatever. They didn't have any traditions, and they knew that it did make them drunk. And they just came to believe that if you drank any alcohol, you became completely, you were not responsible for what you did while you were drunk. And that sort of attitude towards the substance, I think, led to a lot of abuse of it. It made them feel less responsible as people. And it was used by the settlers to the settlers' advantage. Like they would ply the people with alcohol. And so, yeah. Okay. But yeah, this idea of learning the language, manners, and customs was, in a sense, so that you could trade. Because if you know nothing about the customs of the people or know nothing about their language, it would be very hard to trade, to do anything, right? Okay, very good. Okay, let's look on to the next passage here. And so we don't start reading at the beginning. We go down to the bottom. There's the red part. Okay, what are we looking at here?
The doors.
Secondary, right. And I've so many times when I was first leading this class, and if I get a question like this, I would just start reading, and you just don't know. This might be someone writing from a long time ago. And until you get down to the bottom, you haven't figured that out. And it's so much more efficient if you read and figure that out, figure out what you're looking at. And look at the title of the book too. Ecological imperialism. What in the world do you think that might even mean? Ecological imperialism. The biological expansion of Europe. How about Harriet? Let's hear from you.
I would guess that would refer to like all the diseases and stuff that they brought with them from Europe.
Okay, it could be.
But I
That would
don't
be,
know.
yeah, that's a good thing, right? Right. That is going to be included in here, right? So ecological imperialism, imperialism is a really bad, that's like an insult. But they're talking about the ecology, the natural things that are happening, and disease is like a natural process. And they're going to be importing it as they go around the world. Okay, so let's have somebody, how about Sonnet, thank you. There you go, you can start right up at the top.
The isolation of the native peoples of the Americas from the old world germs prior to the last few hundred years was nearly absolute. Not only did very few people of any origin cross the great oceans, but those who did must have been healthy or they would have died along the way, taking their pathogens with them. Native Americans were not without their own infections, of course, but Native Americans seem to have been without any experience with such old world maladies as smallpox and measles. Indications of the susceptibility of Native Americans to old world infections appear almost immediately after the intrusion of the whites. In 1492, Columbus kidnapped a number of the Arawak Indians to train as interpreters and to show King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. Several of them seem to have died on the stormy voyage to Europe in 1493. In 1495, Columbus sent 550 Arawak slaves off across the Atlantic to be put in work in Spain. The majority of these soon were also dead. What killed the Arawaks in 1493 and 1495? Columbus certainly did not want to kill his interpreters, and slaves and slaveholders have no interest whatever in the outright slaughter of their property. The most likely candidates for the role of exterminator of the first Native Americans in Europe were those that killed so many other Arawaks in the decades immediately following old world pathogens.
Yeah, pathogen. You know what the term pathogen means?
Like germ,
Germs,
disease.
right? Germs, right? Right. Be like COVID spreading around. Some of you know that I led a class for 3 summers called Epidemics, Their Impact on US History. It was a COVID thing. And it was actually very, very fascinating to read about that and to realize, like, why is anyone, I think somebody might have mentioned it maybe in one of their summer book reviews about why the Native peoples, one of the reasons why they were so susceptible to these European diseases or old world diseases. Like, why didn't they have them in America? Sarah.
They were completely isolated from the rest of Afro-Eurasia.
Yeah, they were. And some historians, so they just never had them. It's like, if COVID had never come here, if it had stayed over in China. But there was, some historians have hypothesized that it was because Europeans had a whole lot of different types of domesticated animals. The Indians would have had some sorts of dogs. We probably, oh, did we have a dog there on Joshua's lap here? That's very appropriate. You have your dog here, or is your cat, they had dogs in America, and they had, like in South America, they used llamas for pack animals, but they didn't have pigs, they didn't have chickens, they didn't have cows, they didn't have goats. They had a whole lot of animals that had been domesticated for centuries in the old world, and that people had been mingling with, had been in close contact with. And have any of you heard that theory that children develop fewer allergies if they've had a dog in the family from when they were very little? I don't know if any of you have ever heard that. I felt good about reading that. It's like, oh yeah, my kids are okay. We had goats, we had chickens, we had dogs and cats, we had them all. And just that familiar, that closeness, the dog is slobbering on you and everything, you're mixing up all the microorganisms, that's actually helpful. And the Indian population didn't have that. They didn't have large domesticated animals that would have certain diseases that would get transferred over to people eventually somehow, but they didn't have them. There wasn't their way of life. They didn't have those animals. And, they were hunting deer, but the deer weren't living in paddocks, in little fenced areas right by them. So I thought that was an interesting idea. But yeah, okay, so let's go on to the questions here. How about, who would like to read this one? How about, Ava, do you want to read this question, number 6?
Alrighty, okay. So number 6, which of the following developments in the late 1400s and early 1500s is depicted in the excerpt? A, Native Americans adapted to diverse geographical environments and developed complex societies. B, alliances with Europeans aided some Native American societies in their efforts to conquer rival powers. C, Europeans persecuted for their religious beliefs established a new separatist settlements in the Americas. And D, Europeans undertook voyages across the Atlantic to the Americas in search of new sources of wealth.
Okay. What do you think, Zoe?
Okay, so just going down the list, we can eliminate A because it's not really discussing how they adapted to diverse geographical environments, because he did take some of them as hostages, but there was not like any elaboration on them actually adapting to it, and quite the contrary, it made them sick. And then B, so that, well, I guess A could be like an opposite answer. B is, well, the alliance that's kind of beyond the text, it might have been that, but they weren't really trying to conquer rival powers, so that one could be eliminated too. And then the Europeans did not persecute for their religious beliefs, and they weren't establishing all these new things in America. They were just going, as Dee would say, to find new wealth. And that also goes back to the other passage.
It does. And you've got to really notice the time frame here, the late 1400s. What's an example of a major turning point event in the late 1400s? In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. A little poem I always knew because I was born on the original Columbus Day. My birthday is October 12th. So I always know that little poem. And the early 1500s, just, you know, a couple of decades after that. So this is very early. They're not like the Pilgrims are not coming over yet. This is a century before that. So yeah, we can zap out those two. And there were alliances later, like the French and Indians against the American colony, you know, the British colonists, that sort of thing. That's going to happen, but again, not in this time period, not in this early time period when they're just starting out. But yeah, the Europeans undertook voyages across the Atlantic to the Americas in search of new sources of wealth. Ties in with our previous questions. Very good. Okay. How about Roshan? Do you want to read this one, number 7 for us?
In the excerpt, Crosby makes which of the following claims about the transmission of Old World diseases to the Americas? A. It had minimal effect on Native Americans. B. It was an unintended consequence of contact between the New World and the Old World. C. It was significant in the centuries prior to Columbus's arrival in the Americas. And D. It was a deliberate act on the part of Columbus.
Okay, what do you think there? How about let's hear from Helen and then Zoe. Okay, Helen?
Okay, I think the answer is B, and I'll explain why. So A, that's clearly false since almost 95% of Indians were killed off by diseases and other things. C is also false because before Columbus's discovery of the Americas, the Old World diseases didn't exist there.
Right.
And then D, it mentions in the text that Columbus certainly did not want to kill his interpreters. So I don't think it was a deliberate act on his part. So it was an unintended consequence.
Yeah, and he thought the king might like having all these Indian slaves brought back over. Hey, this would be a good source of labor for Spain. And it just didn't work out. So yeah, so then we're left. That's a great elimination thing. An unintended consequence. Yeah, they didn't. And who knew in those days? I mean, anyone know like around what time period the whole theory of transmission of diseases by microbes came about? Do y'all know when that was? Well, I better check the chat. It was pretty late.
Sorry, when was it? When was
Yeah,
what?
the 1800s. Tabitha said, yeah, like the later 1800s too. Yeah, it just was not an early idea. They didn't know. They had no idea. They had no idea about, you know, it's a good idea to wash your hands and all that stuff. They did not know. So it was unintended. And even with our guide, remember our primary source document analysis, our first one about the painting of the Indian village, that in the book that it was printed in, there's something in there, I can't remember what page it was on, but there's something in that book about, oh, we were so surprised to hear that after we had visited a village, that a few weeks later, many of the people died. You know, I mean, they were surprised. They didn't know this would be the consequence of their visiting. And I like too the point in the passage about if there were, you know, an occasional person or two who made it over in some little rowboaty thing across the Atlantic. Well, they must have been extremely healthy, and they weren't sick. But when you start, like, what was it? There was some Irish monk who people think might have gotten over to Newfoundland or something. But it was just like a couple of people, but not a big boatload. Okay, when you start bringing over boatloads of people, then you're going to be bringing some of them who are not so healthy and are coming down with things. And just like, remember with COVID, that there was a thought that you probably could spread it even if you weren't showing major symptoms, you might still spread it. And that probably was something that was happening too, that the Europeans might not have really been sick, but they had some of these pathogens and passed them on.
Did they not question why everyone, all the Native Americans they came in contact to were dying?
Well, they probably wondered, and sometimes, when you don't know and you are very religious, what might you think?
Oh, I see.
You might think, God is clearing the paths for me. God, now we can come in. Definitely the Pilgrims felt that way when they settled in their place in Cape Cod. It was they settled in a town that had been emptied of Indians who had all died from some sorts of illnesses, measles, smallpox, whatever, from European traders coming in, not colonists, but traders. Traders had been coming through, for decades, and would stop in and hey, give us some skins or hides and we'll sell you some tomahawks and or give you some alcohol, and they were passing on illnesses. So everyone in the area where the Pilgrims settled, that was a cleared area because the Indian tribe had died, and many of them would view it as, oh, this was cleared by God for us. What do they know? And you're going to use what you know and what your kind of worldview and your beliefs are, and it seems so logical. Okay. But yeah, it was a very good question, Saraga. Okay, let's look at the next question here. I'll read this one just to be quick. Which of the following describes Crosby, that's our historian here, Crosby's overall argument in the excerpt about the reason for the change in Native American populations after 1492? Okay, A, slaveholders overworked enslaved Native Americans in silver and gold mines. Is that his main argument? B, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella commanded Native Americans to immigrate to Spain. Yeah? No, right, bad. Native Americans had no immunity to new diseases introduced by Europeans. Yes, bing, that's it. And let's look at it. You always want to read every choice because there might even be another better one. Christopher Columbus pursued a policy of genocide against Native Americans. Now, he's arguing that it was unintended. There are certainly people, how, my birthday, Columbus Day, the original Columbus Day. Do anyone know what it's now usually called, even on calendars or something?
Indigenous Peoples Day.
Indigenous Peoples Day, something like that. And there are all sorts of, when my birthday comes around, I'll give you some links to things about, the current protests about Columbus Day and all this. And it's like, well, I just have to say, I mean, what do you think about that, kids? Because it does bring up an interesting issue in history. Can you look at all of history as being absolutely good, absolutely bad? They should never have done this. They should be condemned, and we should all go back to square one where we were 1,000 years ago, and then the world would be happy. What do you think of that idea, or is that realistic, or what do you think? What do you think, Roshan? You're shaking your head. Okay, Ava, are you just twirling your hair? Are you?
I can answer.
Okay, good,
I
good.
think realistically, obviously, so many bad things have happened in history that, like, honestly, like, if we could go back, like, we could make the Black Death never happen or something like that.
Yeah.
But everything, no matter what religious background you have to understand that, like, everything has happened. That everything that's happened in history has led us up to this moment, and we've learned from all of those things.
Mhm.
So, kind of going down a tangent to a degree,
That's
but
okay.
it's important that those things happened, if that makes sense, even if they're not nice things or things we don't like.
Yeah, often some blessings can come out of those curses or whatever. There can be problems. And interestingly, like bringing up the Black Death, that was another disease that traveled, probably from, maybe someplace in the Middle East or India, traveled over to Europe and infected things. And so this is like always happened. Would every person in the world be happy to just always stay in this place where I was born? I'm going to stay here till I die. I'm going to be happy. Is that realistic? Has it ever happened? You go back in ancient history and people were traveling around, and go back to the Middle Ages, or you go to, China and the Mongol hordes or the Huns coming into Eastern Europe. There was always people traveling around and moving to different places. And it just seems to be the way of development, of a lot of good things. As Ava said, a lot of good things can come out of these migrations, a lot of good things. But there's always going to be some bad consequences.
Like the abolition of human sacrifice, which the Aztecs were all into.
Yeah. Hey, who's that? Who's talking? I can't see you. Is that someone
Oh,
who? Oh, it's Sebastian.
Sebastian.
Okay, yeah. Get on your screen there. There we go. Okay, yeah. Right. Like there's no more Aztec children sacrifices at the tops of those pyramids. Those weren't just nice, pretty buildings. They were sacrificing lots of people up at the tops of them. And that doesn't happen anymore. Is that good?
Also,
Mhm.
so I forgot what I was gonna say. There's a difference between like not saying like, oh, we should go back in time and change something, and addressing the ramifications of what was done in the past. Because for certain communities, the ramifications of like colonization and the genocide of their people still affects them to this day in reservations where they don't have access to the same high quality resources that maybe we do, or that people not born on a reservation do. So I think we should look, like, I think there's like different opinions on paying reparations, but I think it's important to at least make sure that the people who have been so negatively affected by America's actions in the past aren't currently suffering. Like, yeah.
Yeah, and Sonnet's got an idea and then a thought.
I was just gonna say, like, a lot of events in history both have like good and bad to them. Like Columbus may have been not the best Native Americans, but he also like discovered the new world. So like a lot of things can have good and bad ramifications at the same time, and nothing is just good or bad. Like you have to look at all sides of the thing before making like a decision about her opinion.
And so I always say to everybody that in life, we're usually not faced with this choice is 100% good, this choice is 100% bad. Which do you choose? Oh, the good one. Usually, almost every choice we make if we do A, we won't have time to do B. You know, if I decide I want to go out and hike in my woods and collect mushrooms for an hour and a half every day, that is something I like to do, kids. And I'm not going to have time to play pickleball, okay? I'm going to have to make choices in my life as to how I spend my time. And that's true on every scale of our lives. Like we can't do everything all the time. Or if I'm going to focus on learning how to play piano, I might not be able to also focus on playing cello, okay? We're going to have to make choices, and some choices are going to mean we now can't do something else. And that's a reality. Yeah, that, I mean, we all, except for Roshan, who's over in India, we're all here in America now. Some of you have families who pretty recently, how many of you have parents who are first generation immigrants? Okay, we have quite a few. And I bet of other kids in the class, we have more. Every year I have a lot of kids who are first generation, you know, their parents were first generation immigrants. And, you know, they came over here for a reason. What was their reason? And there always, anyone know about this? There's sort of a theory about immigration. There's like 2 reasons you go somewhere. One is called push and the other is called pull. Okay. You can be pushed out of a certain place. Why might you be pushed out of a certain, you know, your old place where you live? What would be some examples of things that might push you out of where you used to live? Joshua?
Boundary changes. A lot of Texans were Mexicans before they were Texans, just because the border changed and
Right.
not they moved anywhere.
Right. Yeah, that's like the border moved. We didn't move. Right. That's a good one. Sarah?
There's war. Oh, sorry. There's religious persecution.
Yeah.
There's death.
Yeah.
Poverty.
Opportunity, did somebody say?
Poverty as a
Poverty. Yeah, that would be a push. Like, I'm so poor in my old home that I just can't survive. I think I'm going to try out this new area and see if that's any better. And then there's pull. Oh, Rocky is on here, Rakaya. Yeah, she says her family immigrated because of better academic opportunities and safety. Yeah. And so, yeah, there's all sorts of things. And if pull factors would be things like what would pull you to a specific country? Like if you wanted to leave, do we have anyone here whose parents were Chinese immigrants or grandparents? Ephraim, Eliana? You know, often those people leave for pull factors, like they're pulled to the US because, well, Ephraim, do you know anything about why your parents or grandparents wanted to come here?
They want to escape from communism.
Yeah, they wanted to escape from communism. We have a lot of fascinating history interviews, by the way, on our site, old ones done with kids who interviewed like grandparents or parents who were escaping communist countries. I mean, in this country today, it's kind of common to say, oh, that was just silly to be so scared of communism, until you talk to someone who actually lived under it and find out what they were wanting to be escaping from. And then you say, ooh, okay, I get it now. Yeah. What in your family's case, Eliana, what do you think their reason for coming to the US or leaving China?
Oh yeah, both my parents came to America for graduate school.
I'd say that's probably one of the most common things I hear from kids is like their parents or grandparents came for grad school. They got out of China at grad school, and then it's like, I think I'll just stay. I'll just stay here. I've also seen that many of the Chinese American families I know who are homeschooling, that I know through our classes, they have a lot of kids. Could they have had those kids if they lived in China? Probably not. Some of you might not be here, you know, if your parents had decided to stay in China. So that's, you know, there are all sorts of reasons people want to travel and pick up their families. It's not an easy thing to do. Saranga, why did your family, if they came from India, why did they decide to move to America?
My parents came to America to do grad school, like
Okay.
Elia
Oh, you know.
mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah, I think like their goal was always to stay in America because there are better job opportunities and education opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
But like what's interesting is now I feel like less people are immigrating from India to the US because like India's economy has developed a
Oh, it's
lot. It's
picking
one of the
up. Yeah.
fastest growing economies. And like I actually visited this summer. I got back like last week.
Oh, really?
And like the last time I went was like 5 years ago, and I definitely saw it was really different. It was a lot like cleaner and more developed, I guess. So,
Interesting, interesting. But you could see that's a historical thing to see change over time. And often you can't see that unless you've seen this time and then now you see later. That's going to be a real theme all year. And too bad you couldn't meet Roshan over there when you were there. But India is a big country. You might have been in a completely different part. But yeah, it's always interesting to have, we always have a big mix of kids from all different nationalities in APUSH. And it's so fascinating to hear the stories of your families and why they immigrated, and keep those in mind, the reasons your families came here. Keep them in mind when you read about the Pilgrims, the Puritans, or the settlers in Jamestown. Were they at all similar? You know, Zoe, I think you mentioned your family was, your parents were immigrants, or what's your situation?
No, it was just my mom. She immigrated when she was 3 because of the war, and they wanted safety, so they actually came like on a pirate ship, and then they went separately because my grandpa wasn't there. So my mom, her sister, and her mom immigrated, and then my grandfather found them on it because he came from a different ship.
Wow. And what country did they come from? Can you unmute yourself?
Vietnam.
Vietnam. Oh my gosh. Wow. Okay. Interesting. We have some great, you're going to have to look up the history interviews. I have to tell you some of them. It's great history interviews with kids who interviewed like their father or their grandfather about being a Vietnamese boat person after the Vietnam War. And absolutely fascinating. And often people won't tell these stories unless it's a school assignment and they're helping their kid get an A in the project. Then they'll tell the story. But many kids, you know, have never heard these stories until this is an official APUSH interview, and you have to tell me this part of your story. So that's fascinating. Yeah. So you must come from a sort of a mixed cultural background, because your name Pulitzer doesn't sound Vietnamese. So interesting. We always have a lot of kids with like really mixed backgrounds. I know Sarah has a really mixed, very interesting mixed background. So you'll have to post your family history, Zoe. Okay, let's go on. Let's do one more question, and then we've got to let you get to bed. Okay, number 9. Which of the following best describes evidence? Historians like evidence. Which of the following best describes evidence used by Crosby to support his argument about the change in Native American populations after 1492, the big turning point? A, the Spanish sought to use Native Americans as laborers on encomiendas. I probably butchered the Spanish name. Yep, Helen says, B, Columbus trained Native Americans as translators and guides. C, enslaved Americans were taken to Europe who were taken to Europe experienced high mortality rates. Well, they did, yeah. Some diseases, and here's D. Some diseases affecting Native Americans originated in the Americas. Well, I'd say, yeah, it's going to be that. This is question number 9. Yep, it's going to be that enslaved Americans taken to Europe had high mortality rates, right? And probably, I mean, think of, probably some of you have read a little bit about, African slavery, bringing Africans over, and often certainly a lot died on the voyage over, but a lot did survive and even, did just fine in areas where even the white settlers didn't do so well. And some people say, well, they came from a similar type of climate, or they'd had, malaria over in Africa and they could survive. So it's interesting. If they had brought 500 Africans over and they all died, they might have decided, this isn't going to work out. We won't do this. But, it's almost like, unfortunately, they survived, and then that became like a horribly lucrative trade. Okay. Oh, let's just at least read this passage, because this is an interesting one and gives us, who was it? Sirag, I think, talking about it's important to look at the other side, the negative consequences of things. And there are always going to be voices. If something is unjust or not good, and it's never like everyone says, oh, just keep doing it. That's great. That's the way the world is. Just keep doing it. I mean, that's not the way the world is either. The way the world is, there's always like adjustments. And if something gets really out of line one way, well, there are going to be people who are going to be protesting and saying this isn't right. And that's what this is here. It's, again, you can tell by the date. We're going to be looking at a primary document here. How about I read this one, and this is going to be our last one here. So this is a friar, like a priest, a Spanish priest, a missionary. And he's writing to the king, to the emperor of Spain. I write an account to your majesty as the first person to come among these natives. These Indian people of New Spain, Mexico, are vassals of your majesty. I dare plead with you for a remedy, because for their people to be saved, they are in great need of relief in order to devote themselves at least somewhat to matters of faith. After all, it is the struggle for their salvation that justifies their discovery. That whole idea that we talked about before about, us not thinking that the British were very interested in that, but the Spanish really were. Well, here's a Spanish missionary. I firmly believe that if the decrees your majesty sent here for their benefit were implemented, and if the governors and judges did more than pretend to do so, great good would come to these people. Even more firmly, I believe that your majesty's intention is that they be saved and that they know God. For this to happen, they must have some relief, so that with the moderate labor needed to meet their tribute obligation, what modern word might we use for tribute obligation? What would that translate into? How about
taxes?
Taxes, yeah, they're taxes. They're taxes. They've got to give stuff, tribute obligation. They can still give themselves wholeheartedly to our teachings. He's teaching them about the Catholic faith. Otherwise, God will have good reason to complain. For Spaniards came to this land and have taken their property for their own benefit, and your majesty Majesty has extracted great benefit from them too. Your Majesty should know that the Indians who are required to labor for a master in Mexico City in domestic service and bring firewood, fodder, and chickens leave their pueblo for a month at a time. And the poor Indians often have to buy these things because they're not to be found in their pueblos, their settlements. Take pity on them and consider what is happening to the poor Indian woman who is in her house with no one to support her and her children, for her husband is hard pressed to meet his tribute requirement. I advise you that if your Majesty does not establish that the Indians be required to pay tribute only from what they have, within 30 years, these parts will be as deserted as the Caribbean islands, as so many souls will be lost. So he's noticing, by the way, a change over time, talking about that idea like Saraga noticed in going back to India. He's noticing a change over time in the Caribbean islands. What has apparently happened there?
Probably what happened here, right? Did they all die in the Caribbean
Yeah,
islands? I mean, I
they,
know that's what happened to the Taino on Hispaniola.
yeah, many of them died. Again, the disease factor and probably the overworking.
Almost.
Yeah, so the disease.
Overworking confined disease would have been too much.
Right. So this is a good example, though, to Saraga's point, that there should be voices protesting. There should be voices who say, wait a minute, hold on, we're doing the wrong thing. We should change our ways. And that's what's going on here is we're having a primary document that's showing this even at the time. And you're going to find it, keep your eye on that all through US history. A lot of times in the document-based questions that give you a whole bunch of documents that you've got to use in writing your essay, they'll have this point of view and a contrasting point of view. They'll sort of keep going down with a matched pair of contrasting documents. Okay, we're not going to have time. I don't want to keep you up past, I really appreciate that you've all stayed in here so long here. I know some of you probably had to go. But we're going to stop here. And I know that, if you didn't have a chance to finish all of these already on your own, you can finish them up this week. And I think this was helpful. I enjoyed talking with you kids and hearing your good ideas and seeing you and hearing from you. And I think it was great. So I'm looking forward to our next one will be in 2 weeks. Okay, we have this MCQ meetup and then we have a week off and then we have 2 weeks in a row. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. And does anyone have any questions about anything in the class for right now? You're all hanging in there pretty good. Sebastian's or Joshua's. Let's hear from Sebastian, then Joshua. Okay, can you unmute yourself, Sebastian? Sebastian, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. Actually, no, Rachel answered it for me on the website. That's fine.
Okay,
Thanks.
great. Yeah, our TAs are great about answering questions. Did you have a question, Joshua, or comment?
So how similar in kind of the structure is the APUSH exam to AP World History?
Very similar, very similar. It's going to have 55 multiple choice questions. And they'll be like this with the passage and then some questions. You might have noticed like the last three or four questions in this set didn't seem that related to the passage. And those are just the AP classroom set. Often they'll have a couple at the end that are just one-off questions. They're on the time period, but they're not directly related to a passage. But on the APUSH exam, you're going to have these sets of like 2, 3, 4 questions related to a passage, a primary or a secondary document, and you have 55 of them. Those come first. Then the SAQs, the short answer questions, which you probably had in world history. And then you get a break, then you get a bathroom break, kids. Use the restroom. And you'll come back in 10 minutes. And then you'll have the essay, the real essay parts. The DBQ, and then, which is a document-based question. And then you'll have your choice of, you'll have 3 choices, and you write one essay, the long essay, which is the one we'll be writing in another week and a half. Okay, and then that's it, and then you're done.
Okay, thank you.
Piece of cake. But yeah, they tried to make them very much the same. The time, you know, the amount of time given is the same, and the same structure. So yeah, if you have taken European history or world history AP, you'll help everyone else out. Okay, well, let's all wave goodbye to everybody here. It was great to see you. It was fun to, you know, just seeing one picture of someone, you don't quite get a feel of what they're like, but it's really getting to see you live was really, really fun. Okay, and we know, like, say, Harriet doesn't lie down backwards in a, you know, I don't know what you were lying down in your photo, but it was fun. And I hope all of you get a photo up. I think most of you have one. And we'll see you back on the class website. So long.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. You were the first one and the last one.